Hello, my name's Graham. I'm going to be painting in oils today. I'm an oil painter, a landscape painter, and today I'm going to be painting from an old painting I did a while ago. I have a picture of the old painting here. It's of Maldon, which is near where I am in Essex. Some lovely Thames barges, some buildings, the estuary. Nice cloudy sky which provides a lot of cloud shadows on the ground which help with composition and bringing a little bit of drama into the painting. So that's my reference. I have done a small oil sketch as well in the last couple of days from that old painting, which I no longer have. And this will just help me balance the colours. So when I come to paint this painting today, I'll have a bit of a better idea of how I want to develop the older painting into this slightly newer, perhaps fresher kind of scene. So today I'm going to be painting on MDF, which is a nice strong board. This is 6mm MDF. It's primed 3 times with an acrylic gesso primer, and in that primer I've added a little bit of extra chalk whiting to just give it a bit of extra tooth and absorbency, which will help get the effect that I'm after. My palette here in the studio is quite a large palette, as you can see, and it helps because it keeps me a bit of a distance from the work, so I don't get too tight and too detailed too early on in the painting. A few more colours here than I'd usually use outside. In the studio here I've got a range. Titanium white is my basis, my main colour. From that I've got 2 blues, ultramarine blue and Prussian blue. And that helps me get sort of slightly warmer and slightly cooler blues, especially in the skies. The ultramarine, being a semi-transparent colour, really helps to get some darks in those early stages as well. I have 2 reds as well, a rose madder and a bright red. And then I have some earth colours, a light red, a yellow ochre and a burnt sienna. And then Viridian green, which is lovely to mix with the rose madder and the bright red to get some lovely greys, mixing those 2 complementaries together, and a cadmium yellow for brightness. Naples yellow's also on the palette. I don't use it that often, but it can sometimes freshen up the highlights, give a bit more warmth to some of the highlights. And again, just before we start, the solvent I'm using is actually Zest-It, so it's a bit less sort of toxic, less environmentally damaging perhaps than white spirit or terps, and it doesn't give off such a strong odour either, so I quite like using that. Right, so to begin I'll use my reference there, together with the old painting, which is just out of shot, but I approach the painting in a very sort of simple way. First of all, I'll use a sort of number 4. You can see it's quite a worn number 4, and just a dab of spirit on there. I'm going to mix my 2 sort of semi-transparent dark colours, which are ultramarine blue and then burnt sienna. And together those 2 provide quite a nice dark base that can either be pushed slightly cooler with the ultramarine or slightly warmer with more burnt sienna, so it gives you that flexibility in these sort of early stages. I'm just mixing up a dark, semi-transparent dark to start with, and my first approach is going to be to just make some of those marks where the shadows and the real darks are, so I don't have to think about drawing every little bit of the painting, because the way the painting is going to evolve is by sort of cutting in, you know, making shapes from previous marks. So really the last thing I want is to have a shape all drawn in correctly, ready to fill in colour. That will kind of hamper the progress of the painting a little bit. So just establishing, I think first of all I'm going to establish the horizon line, which is quite low, so I can fit nice sort of meaty clouds in there, some nice darks and some nice blue sky as well, so keep the horizon quite low, and I'm just going to think about where the river's going to go. It's a nice sort of S shape leading in to the composition. The main focal point is going to sit over here where the barges are going to be. And as you see with this, I'm not fussing, I'm just going to place in some of the darks. The sun for my painting is going to come in from the right hand side. So just thinking about where I'm going to position these bits and pieces. The building's going to go there, a bit of dark for the boats down there, and then now I've got that building in place, I can then just put a shadow side of the barge in, perhaps the underside just briefly, and the top. Similar for the next barge along. In the original painting here, I've got very evenly spaced masts, which things like that can often happen when you're excited about painting a view. You focus on what there is in it, and sometimes take an eye off the best way to compose the painting. So now I've got the chance here in enlarging this, I'm going to just vary the spacing between those barges, so just to create a bit more interest really. So here we go, a little mark there just to mark off where some of these buildings are going. Some of these sheds in the distance here are actually black sort of wooden sheds, I think. So there's quite a lot of dark in there, and I'm just adding a bit more ultramarine into the mix to make it slightly bluer as it's in the background. Let's think how far I'm coming over. And again, these are all just sort of dots and dashes, but the beautiful thing about painting is to put things down and slowly it evolves into something. So I'm quite happy at the moment with where this is going. Just think about these masts, because that's quite important. This one will have to sit here, but I think we could bring one in slightly closer behind, and maybe slightly shorter in there. Right, I'm just going to mix a little bit of the of yellow ochre into this mix, because it's got the ultramarine in there. It's just going to sort of push it slightly towards green, but without too much punch. So the idea here is to work quite muted and quite dark, and slowly build up to richer colour and lighter colour as well. So just see where I am with this. Little building coming in there, and then this distance. Again, just a bit more ultramarine in this, and it's quite dark. I do love that, especially round here. It's quite flat, and you get some very obvious sort of changes in distance. You know, especially on lovely cloudy days like this, you get nice cloud shadows that just break up the distance into these horizontal bands, and there's a lovely dark in the background, which I'm just putting in with a bit more ultramarine, so it's a bit cooler and doesn't come forward too much, even though it's a dark colour. So there's some nice sort of boats and things going on here, and putting that dark behind is going to help to just have a background to punch some of these boats off. There we go. And that's more or less just some sort of contour ideas here, so we get the impression of a flatter sort of ground leading back to these, and that's probably it for the drawing stage. As I say, I don't want to go too detailed with this, because for me that's not what painting's about. It's about sort of slowly building and refining, adding more colour and more paint all the time. And as I say, if I were too detailed with the drawing at this stage, it would be a matter of colouring it in, and it's very easy to distract yourself from colour harmonies and tonal values if you're focusing on one element of the painting at any one time. So the next thing is to pick up a slightly larger brush. I've got a number 8 here. Again, these are quite, I like when a brush is new, it's quite sort of quite crisp and lovely for making certain marks, but I do love a brush when it's been worn down slightly and these flats almost become filberts with rounded corners, and that's lovely for mark making. You get a great variety by just twisting the brush round. So the first thing I'm going to do, the approach I've got to this really is to see, to establish something first of all. And for me in this painting, because it's more of an atmosphere painting, I'm less interested in the exact sort of the exact detail of the boats or the buildings. It's just they're there to provide a focal point, and it's actually about the atmosphere and how the light comes through the clouds. So because of that, I'm going to start by mixing a titanium white as my base for the light, the sky, which is often the lightest part of the painting. And I'm just going in with a little Prussian blue. It's a very strong colour, so only a touch will just turn that to a nice sort of distant sky blue. But because I'm sticking on the more muted side, I'm going to add a little of the light red to that, a little bit of ultramarine as well, just until I get a colour that's a little more muted. I do like painting quite muted, so I'm using this little colour sketch as a reference. I think that might still be a bit too bright, so I'm just going to add a little red and yellow to this just to knock it back. Again, when colour mixing, just sort of thinking, I suppose, about the colour wheel and the complementaries as well. So if you have a blue that's a little too garish and too bright, a little bit of orange, or if you've got on the palette here a bit of yellow and red to make orange, will just knock back the intensity of that blue a little bit. So for now, I think that's okay. And again, I'm not too worried. This can change. That's fine. But it's just a matter of getting something down, because until you've got something down, you've got nothing to reference against. So this blue, as I say, may well change as the painting develops. But for now, if I don't get anything down, trying to pitch the right colour immediately would be very difficult. So let's just have a look in here. Notice in my sketch here, it becomes a lot warmer in the distance, almost a bank of sort of purplish cloud, which I rather like. So just adding some more red into that and bringing the tones closer here, because what I'm kind of thinking about is drawing the eye to the focal point here, where we've got some nice sunlight on the boat and the building. So to prevent distraction here, I'm just bringing the tones slightly closer together. So might seem quite dark at the moment, but the darker it is, the more the highlights will pop out and sing. Right, so just tweaking this colour every time. If you go back for more colour, tweak it slightly. Don't be precious about sort of keeping a puddle of sky colour. That's what that's my. Eventually, as you apply more layers and more brush strokes, you'll end up with a flatter colour and a flatter patch in your painting. If you have to mix the colour again, it'll be slightly off the original mix, and that will just mean it becomes richer and more interesting to look at. So let's just establish some of these cloud shapes. Scrub the paint on, not being too precious. While I've got some of this sort of darker grey blue on the brush, I'm just going to add a bit of bright red to it, but not too much. Just going to lay that in there as the sort of a shadow area on the water. And while I'm doing that, I'm going to add a bit of ultramarine blue just to punch the intensity slightly, and that'll be for this foreground area here. And again, it's probably not quite right yet, but it doesn't matter. Get it down and we can alter it later. So beginning to sort of close up into what the image is about. We've got this streak of light here, which we want to keep. the background there has moulded into sort of one layer, which is nice. And the next thing, into the blue, I'm just going to add a bit more of the bright red and work on some of the patches of sand or mud, actually. So it's a very muddy sort of area. You get, it's very difficult to get the colour, actually. It's a sort of sandy, muddy, purpley, yellowy colour. It's very interesting. I don't think it's got a name, but keeping the colours muted in the shadows also helps. So that's a little bit of that in there, and just against there as well. So before I do too much more, I'm just going to have a little look just to see if the balance is looking right, and it's not too far off. Just make that line a little more less defined. Sorry. I'm going to go back with my smaller brush and mix up a colour for some of the rooftops. So the idea here is that I'm darting around the painting, trying to place things in once they once the painting's ready for it, really. So there's no point in establishing certain things until other things are there. So by putting the sky, a bit of reflected colour into the water, you have the idea of the atmosphere and the sort of the colour temperature of the painting, really. Once you've got that on your palette, you can mix into that, especially for the distant colours, and use a bit of that atmospheric colour just to knock back the intensity of some of the more distant buildings. So I've mixed up a tile colour, but mixing into the blue sky, and that's just by adding a bit of bright red into the blue mix, which eventually included colours like yellow ochre, ultramarine, Prussian blue, a bit of titanium white and burnt sienna, and it all sort of creates a nice sort of grey blue in the end. So this one, I'm just gonna like angle again, not drawing too detailed. There's a few buildings sort of that go off into the distance, so a bit of colour will help at this stage. Right. Next thing is just to vary the colour. So a bit of yellow ochre and a bit more bright red will give me another sort of tile roof colour. That's going to be slightly more punchy. Not too much at this stage, but just a slight increase in saturation and a slight sort of variation in colour, because this roof is actually facing the source of the light, so it's going to have a bit more intensity. And back into that first colour, actually, the colour I've used to draw in here will just knock that tile colour down a bit for these background buildings. So there. Again, not too much detail, just enough. If you start, I always find that if you're painting and you start thinking, oh yes, this is a building, this is the, these are the tiles, the chimneys going on there, then suddenly you're too involved with it. So then move on to another part of the painting. That just helps to keep things fresh, I think. Right, just because it interests me, I'm going to go in and try and place a colour for the shadow on the side of this boat cast by the boat next to it. I just want to get that in because the board will act as some sunlight for now, and so that just creates a bit more of a three-dimensional shape. We have the sort of semi-shadow cast by the boat, the darker side of the boat from the original drawing, and then the board left there for the highlight so far. So that's that one. We can then cut into the side of this boat with the shadow for the next one. That's slightly more blue because it's a blue boat. I have to vary the tone of that. Actually, I got the tone slightly wrong. So just ultramarine and burnt sienna again, just to make a darker tone. It's probably okay for now. It's a bit of a darker boat here, and the lovely thing about priming your own board, especially with that quite thick gesso mix, is that you can put as many or as few brush strokes in as you like, and make them as thick or as smooth as you like. I quite like working on a textured board, and so you can get these sort of dry brush effects that sort of help piece the painting together without being too too flat to begin with. So it gives you a bit of texture to work off, and some of those stay in the final painting. I love that look of sort of the texture of the board becoming part of the painting as well as the brush strokes. So just mixing up a slight slight colour here, slightly similar, I should say, to the sky, but not exact. Right. We need to knock back some of these sort of white patches in here, because the the detail of the boats needs something to lay against in the foreground. So back to the larger brush, which is the number 8. I tend to forget what numbers the brushes are, especially these are reasonably new brushes, but after a while the numbers rub off, and I can't actually often remember what numbers they are. So this is just a dark purple which has come from the original colour, and then adding in all these other sort of colours that are currently on the palette, the tile colour, the sky colour. It's just given me a dark to really sort of anchor this foreground with this shadow. So I just add a little bit over here. Right. Now we've got a bit more on the board, I can then work out where I want my real highlights to be, and I quite like the light on the side of that building, but I think I need to knock it back slightly, because for the good of the painting, I think the boat would make a nicer sort of focal point. So I'm just using a bit of that Naples yellow, as it's a sort of a sunlit area, with some white, but just knocking the mix into colours that are already on the palette, just to create a sort of an off-white. Just add a bit more tile colour into that so it's a little warmer. That looks a bit cool. There we go. Something like that. It's just enough to put it there for now, and it also gives me a bit more room in values to really ping the highlight of the boat a little later on. So as you sort of develop the painting, you see these little areas and you kind of think, how much further do I need to develop that in order to have the information on the board that I need to make the next stroke register. So with that same colour mixed, I'm going to sort of really go in with a bit more titanium white, but this still has that influence of the tile colour and many other mixes on the palette. Just loosened it slightly with a bit of the Zest-It, just to see where we are with a cloud colour. I'm going to give a bit more colour to that cloud. If I go slightly too red, I've added a bit of a greeny blue in there mixed from a previous sort of Prussian blue background sky, and that just knocks it back slightly. So, and again, this drawing, you can brush over because that's sort of served its purpose for now. Right. It's important to keep varying the colours, I think. Let's just put some of that up there. The wonderful thing about doing these skies is that you can, they're inspired by reality, real life, and that's where painting outside really helps. You get a sort of memory for these sorts of things and what happens. But when it comes to applying them in the studio later, you have that flexibility to adjust and actually allow the sky to be part of the composition. So you can sort of you know, put cloud formations where you like to balance the composition. And because we've got a nice sweep of the river coming in here towards the focal point, it makes sense just to tilt the cloud slightly and emphasize that sort of V composition. And if you are outside painting anyway, the sky often moves very, very quickly. So it's worth noting, you know, the best bits almost, and then create this sort of composite of best bits. Right, so into that sky colour, I'm just going to mix a bit of the ultramarine blue to get a fresher blue. I will just a touch of Prussian blue as well, just to increase the intensity. Yeah. Just bring a bit of nice blue sky showing through there. So it's all about variety and you know, linking colours as well, because we'll have a bit of the sort of blue coming through on the reflection, so it has to come from somewhere. And whilst it might be above us, out of the picture, it's quite nice to at least reference it or do a nod towards it at the top of the picture here. So, right. As I've got the blue, I may as well keep working within that sort of range. So I've added a bit of titanium white and then just again a touch of that tile colour. So it's great to have these sort of semi-mixes on the palette that you kind of touch into and mix into, and they change, but you still have some left, so you can use that for your subsequent mix, and it creates a nice sort of harmony, I think, between all the colours. Right. Oh yes, forgot what I was doing. This colour, which is a bit of the sky colour with white and the tile colour, I'm just going to place in for some of the highlighted water. Where are we? Down here. And we know that this colour is influenced by the colour above, and therefore it's going to work on the painting. Right. Just washing the brush out a bit because I want to go in for a bit of warmth. So I'm actually going to just start with a bit of white into the tile colour, a bit of Naples yellow, just to see if that's strong enough for the highlighted area of sand. So our boat's here, and yeah, I think we need a bit more colour to that. So a bit more Naples yellow, and just into the that mix of bright red for the tiles again. So for now, something like that will probably work. I quite like to work fairly subtle, so that, you know, nothing is too much of a shock for the painting, and you can always build on the intensity or the the contrast, you know, the values of the colour afterwards. But it's nice to establish things with a bit of reserve. Right, there we go. Just add some of those, just gradually taking away some of these dots that are left. Okay. Right, and again, you know, working all over the board helps. It helps you sort of, it helps to prevent you over developing one area of the painting at any given time. So, you know, it could be very easy to focus on details. Speaking of which, just pop that in there. But you might not need the detail in the final painting. So it's a lot easier to to just, you know, sort of judge where you are with the painting and build it up slowly, then go straight in and paint a house and then paint a boat, and, you know, get very excited about that. Like just there we go. That provides quite a nice backdrop now. So now we've got that far, I think I'm just going to dipped into a bit of ultramarine and Prussian blue into the tile colour again, just to create a slightly darker cloud colour, because in the in this image of the original painting, I quite like the darks that come through here, because it's you know, it marries the sky up nicely with the darks in the ground. So perhaps I won't go quite as dark as that, but just get something in there. And it's all a work in progress. Nothing's finished till it's off the easel. Often then it's not even finished, but you know, there's a point at which painting says enough, but that point's not yet. So we can carry on adding bits and pieces without fear, really, because we can always amend it later. And it's great to have something to amend, because, you know, working on a painting with a series of corrections and you know, if you've got something to correct, it's a lot easier than to just go straight in to paint something right first time. So okay, that's quite good. While I've got some of this dark colour, I will just pop some in here as well. So all the time kind of thinking about where I can use colours elsewhere in the painting, and again that just helps build the harmony. You know, this sort of balance of colour, value and brushwork has to work throughout the whole painting for a sort of unified look. Right, so just going into a bit of fresher blue colour, and that's the Prussian blue. I'm just going to break, where are we? Just break this up slightly. Might be a little too much, but yeah, that's okay. Again, thinking about the you know, the balance of the painting, the lovely thing is that you can start sort of thinking about what works with the composition and what sort of what will make the painting rest easier on your eye, or give a journey around the painting for your eye, and you come a little bit further away from, you know, the actual subject matter that is, you know, the buildings or the boats. So looking over here, this light cloud, I don't think we want quite so light, again because it you know, perhaps distracts the eye a little bit. So at this stage in the painting, I'm thinking we'll knock that back, get rid of that that colour of the board, and then we're background here. Yep, that works quite nicely. And again, just thinking about some of that colour in the ground. It's not till the very end that you really have to start sort of focusing a little bit more on bringing things together. At the moment, I'm quite happy flitting between different parts of the painting and just building it up, really. So, mixing a dark colour, not quite as dark as before, so I'm using the light red with the ultramarine, and that has a bit more white in it, so you get a sort of a nice muted purple, whereas the burnt sienna gave you quite a rich dark. And that's because I'm just going to start thinking about some of these sort of masts and boats in the distance. And I don't want anything too dark in terms of these masts, because there we go, just put a couple of bits in, because I don't want them competing with the main subject matter. So the other thing I'll do with it, this is just a small synthetic head brush, quite a cheap brush. I go through them quite quickly, so oil paint isn't very kind to these small brushes, so there's no point in paying too much for them, but they just help give a little bit of sort of detail work. When I say detail, I suppose I mean finer strokes rather than actual detail. A lot of it's suggestion. So that's okay. Just again sort of pushing that background back a little bit. Adding a few sort of dots and dashes. It's lovely in the distance, especially as I say in this area. We've got, you know, quite wide estuaries and flat land, and you get a lot of the you know, a lot of lovely sort of highlights and lowlights and pinpricks of light going into the distance, and it's lovely to suggest it with you know, just blobs of paint, using the colours that you've used across the painting. Right, so now I think it's probably time to do a bit more to the boats, as this has sort of developed. Just loose some of these edges. We'll go back into the sky. I like the idea of in this painting a multi-layered sky. So we have those different sort of stripes of cloud shadow coming through. So we'll put some more light and dark over the top. But there's no need to do that just yet. I'm just going to mix up some titanium white and Naples yellow, which will, as I say, just give the white a bit of warmth and you know, sunlight really. So this might be too intense, but it doesn't really matter at this stage again. So let's just using the side of the brush. And that's probably okay for now. A few suggestions of things behind, and that sort of really helps that shadow side, or I should say the shadow on the same side from the boat next to it. Just using some of the ultramarine and light red again, just to create a bit more colour on the shadow side of the boat, which is a little too intense at the moment, but it's okay for where we are in the painting. This light red is great for the underside of the boats, and indeed for the sails as well. So I'm just going to pop a bit there and back into that sort of darker purpley colour as it continues into the shadow area. You start to build up a real kind of sense of things happening when there isn't really anything there. It's just a muddle of brush strokes at the moment. But that's what I mean about sort of putting some down, and then we'll sort of change them as it goes along. A bit of yellow ochre and light red will create some interest for, you know, some of those buildings. Just vary the tile colour slightly. And again, this is very useful and happened to happen while you know, at the time. But this building here is actually in shadow, and that's quite handy because it's right on the edge of the board, and it could be a distraction in the composition if it were sort of in bright, you know, just lead your eye out of the painting, and you want people to stay in the painting if possible. So I'm just putting that building in just gently at the moment, and I'll put a slightly darker roof on it just to show some form, but we don't want too much attention going over that side, otherwise you'll forget. You know, your eye will go, oh, that's interesting, and then straight out the picture. So going back into the darks, I'm mixing some burnt sienna with ultramarine, and just thinking about these areas, you know, where the sunlight is, there's a bit more contrast. Mixing into the tile colour, I think it's probably, these lines are quite often quite important, just to flatten, you know, the surface. Helps you understand that it's a flat surface rather than, you know, going too steep. Right. Just going back in again with this sort of tile colour, and it's changed over time. So the very first time I mixed it, it's been pushed around a lot since then. It's gone slightly bluer, slightly darker, slightly lighter, and so you end up with a completely sort of different colour, but one that's still still in harmony with the rest of the painting. There is actually a chimney that goes all the way down the side of this building, but I'm choosing to stop it at the top because I don't want to create a very strong vertical that will split that building in half. I think that might actually not be quite so good for the painting. Right, so here we'll go back in to a bit of yellow ochre and ultramarine, and just a touch of the cadmium yellow for the trees. I'm just wiping some of that paint off, but yeah, just add a little bit in there, a bit more of the sky colour, just to lose some of the intensity and contrast. Yeah. Right. And now, with that small brush again, I'm just going into a dark, a sort of dark that was left over on the palette. It's ultramarine and burnt sienna, but I'm adding a bit of the light red just to give a little body to the colour. And using this is actually just an old piece of frame as a marl stick. I'm going to just think where that mast will be and how tall it would be, and then just start to put something in there. And as I say, I wanted to, this is all a bit kind of, it gives me options at the moment. There's paint on there, there's dark, there's a bit of light from the board showing through, so I can really decide where I want the other boats to be, because I wasn't committed to it at the beginning. So that's really dictated by where I want the masts going. So I think what I'll do is have one that's slightly further behind there. As I say, I want to group them less evenly spaced. So I'll put another one here, which I'll just make slightly shorter as well. That may change later, but you get lovely effects sometimes in wet paint, wet and wet, where you drag a dark through a light area, and by the time it's exited the light area, it's dragging the light paint over a dark area. You get that counter change, which is it's almost by accident, but when you know that happens, it's quite nice to use it as design. So right, the next thing, I'll probably put one more. Where are we? Probably need one there. I'm going to go slightly further back here. There. It's just changed the arrangement of those, the spacing, which helps with the composition. Right, some of these are to be honest, it's so far away from the original view at the original time, I'm not quite sure what happened, but I think it'd be nice to bring down some of these into the water as reflections, so we'll do that. Whether it actually happened, I'm not sure, but it doesn't particularly matter if it looks right on the painting. Right, just mixing some Naples yellow with the tile colour, because I remember, and certainly alluded to on the original painting, is some sort of detail of paraphernalia on the surface of the boat, which can just be indicated with dots and dashes at this point. Just knock them back slightly. Right, I don't want, just looking at the painting again, and there's a bit too much light showing through here, so going back with some sort of sky colour that's on the palette, I'm just going to knock some of that back and put some bits and pieces in the background here, just really knocking back the contrast really. Go back in for a bit of ultramarine, because I think back here slightly bluer would be better. Right, back in with the larger brush. Now I've got some other colour mix on the palette. I'm going to add some ultramarine to it and see how it fits with the sky. It's quite a nice green tinge to it actually, so I'm going to add some green into that and just see what happens. Might be a bit too intense. Add a bit more white and blue just to freshen it up slightly. But I want this to be, you know, a bit messier. Nice feel of the cloud. Because the paint's still wet, it's possible just to move it round with your thumb or finger a little bit. Right. Okay, I'm just going to add a little white to the mix, and bring some cloud over here as well. I'm just thinking whereabouts to do that. Right. I just rub that out so it's not quite so intense. As the painting is developed, I'm now able to put on some thicker paint, because I'm quite happy with the positioning of certain elements in the painting. So as the painting develops, you sort of start adding thicker and sort of you can afford to be a little bolder with the brush strokes and where you're placing them. Right. Okay. So it's just a matter of sort of building up. So you know, worked on the sky a little bit. I'm just adding a little of the bright red to the green I'd mixed on the for the trees in the background, and that mutes it down to make a sort of a warm brown, or sort of purpley brown, I suppose. But that colour has a lot to do with the sky and a lot to do with, you know, the other elements of the painting. So it's a nice harmonious colour to add in here. Just gives a bit of form to the foreground. Right, that's slightly intense, so I'll knock that back. Okay. There's another sort of element to this painting which I quite like, which is the secondary sort of nod of interest, which is in the background, where there's just a touch of light shining through, not to compete with the main element of the painting, the main foreground, or middle distance actually, but just enough to create some interest back here. So I'm going to mix up a Naples yellow and bright red mix just to strike across there. And then a little more of the bright red and yellow ochre. Some interest, but the main thing is a white boat, which I'm actually going to just use the sky colour, or a sky colour I should say. It's not actually the sky colour, it's a sky colour that's been formed over the course of mixing, and just highlight a boat that's sitting there. It's actually the top of the boat, and use the small brush. I think I have a darker mask up there but lighter coming down, so it gives a bit more sort of shape and form. A few bits of detail in the background. Right, some ultramarine just to punch that grey bluey colour up a little, and just put some in the background as well. Right, the transition between the sunlit area and the shadow area probably needs a little bit more sort of saturation and almost softening. So I'm going to mix an almost a semi-tone and a semi-colour between the shadow area and the sunlit area, just to help make that transition a little bit easier. Further away the shadow's being cast from, so that, you know, the clouds, the softer the shadow will be. So just need to, without losing the intensity, just soften it slightly, whereas you'll get quite a crisp shadow because this, on the boat for example, where the other boat is very close to it. Right, I think I'll still use this number 4 and go into the light red. It's very intense colour. Quite a few of these colours, the Viridian, Prussian blue, the light red, they're quite intense and quite strong. So you have to sort of use them with a little caution. Just a touch of the rose madder in there as well. And this is the going to be the first attempt, at least, for the colour of the sails. So just might need to look at this to reference exactly how the sails go. Might be a bit too intense because they're going up into the atmosphere, into the sky. I'm adding some of the blue from one of the sky, you know, what's left over on the palette, just to give it some harmony and influence. So that's not too bad. You get these lovely sort of secondary sails coming off them as well. The same with this. Now again, with variety in mind, just going to darken the colour for this one because it seems like this would be nicer perhaps in more shadow. Don't have a lot of information left on my painting. Each time you paint, you sort of simplify, and sometimes painting from a painting, you don't always have all of the information you need, but you can often get away with it, especially if you're painting an atmosphere over a specific study of a boat. Then really it's all to do with how you know, the light is shining or highlighting something. It's not necessarily to do with whether you've got, you know, all the masts and everything exactly right. It's not that important in this sort of painting. Right, so just mixing up a slightly more intense version of the colour as it comes down here into the sunlight. And adding a bit of ultramarine will just give me a darker punch, and that's going to be for some of the shadow areas in the mast. So the sun's coming from here, in the sails I should say. Okay, that'll be okay for now. The one thing about these barges which is lovely is there's a sort of a yellow sort of mast, or a warm yellowish mast. So let's just get that, especially down to where the sun's shining on that boat. Maybe not so much as it goes in against the light sky. That will limit its effect slightly, because then it's light against dark the other way. So here we go. Just adding a few sort of small details, lines, while I've got this small brush in my hand. That's quite a nice way of working as well. If you know, if you've got your brush in your hand, you can do all the bits that you can think of with that need to be done with that size brush, which again sort of helps you dart around the painting rather than just focusing on one element of the painting. Just do this shadow side as well. Right. Just adding a little more white to this, just in case. Yeah, just wanted to add a little bit more character to some of this sunlit area in the form of thicker paint, so it really sort of stands out a little bit. I might just add it back there as well, and just a bit in there. Right, this is actually a blue boat on a sort of just raised above the water here. So I've just put a touch of blue on that, but that helps to push the buildings back, but it needs to sort of cement itself in there slightly. So a bit of burnt sienna again, and ultramarine for a dark, bit more burnt sienna this time, so it goes slightly more brown, slightly darker, and that's sort of the shadowy underside of that boat. And actually that's probably, yeah, just some detail of where it's sitting, and then just add a little white, and I've got a colour then for just the end, which is slightly more sunlit. I think while I've got it as well, while I think of it, add a bit of yellow ochre to the mast colour, and that will just give a suggestion of the underside of that boat without being too descriptive. It links the colour through as well. So let's put a few contour marks in there. Right, the next thing I'm thinking about is a bit more variation on these buildings in the background. So going into the bright red and the various mixes I've got here, perhaps a little more yellow ochre as well. Some of the atmospheric sort of sky blue on there, and start adding a few more sort of details, a few more buildings that actually go into the distance there. Right, just adding some white to the beach colour as well, and I'm going to use that just to provide a sort of a stop for that dark colour, which which is the boat, but that's just a sort of initial shadow plotting in from the beginning of the painting. So to put a line across there will just show you that that's meant to be a boat, and where the tops of the boats are sitting just creates a bit of an illusion of, you know, without being too descriptive, where things start and end. So with some of this I'll add a bit more white, again varying it as we go. as the boats go back. I think it might need freshening up slightly in the background as well, so I'm going to go back into that blue and yeah, give it a little more sort of colour in the background so it's not too dark. Some trees and bits and pieces here as well, just breaking up the horizon. Right, and I think just a bit of information, sort of perceived detail across here. I think there's probably, you know, a line there. The building doesn't go all the way to the shore, so we can lose that edge slightly. And just imply some of the lines. I think the church actually in Maldon is just behind here, so it's not in my painting, but I can just suggest it and indicate its presence, so people who know Maldon will know that perhaps this is the beginning of the church, just off the painting there. Right, so again, just another quick sort of evaluation. I think it's looking okay at the moment. I'm going to add some white into the colour of the sunlit beach, a bit more Naples yellow as well, and just sort of bring some warmth into the clouds up here. And again, that'll make those vertical links, the sort of abstract links within the painting through brushstrokes and colour and highlights and shadow. And they don't have to all be in your face, they can be quite sort of subtle. Just adding a bit more white to this, and I'll just adding some sort of more highlight onto the water, sort of breaking up in areas so it's not such a hard line. I think probably change the shape of that as well. It's a little bit too obvious, that cloud. It's just really a matter of playing around to help the composition, really. Just you find edges that are a bit too straight or things that are a bit too symmetrical. This is quite a nice part of the painting process when you actually are allowed the time. You know, you've done the legwork and you're just sort of playing around trying to balance elements together and, you know, tweak things here and there. It's quite balanced there, which is so easy, I find, to sort of balance elements too much, because your mind all automatically wants to make you know, make things neat and tidy, and nature often isn't neat and tidy. So right, just go back, slightly darker colour, just using the same brush. I don't sort of wash it out too much. So each colour, allow each colour to influence the other, really. That's the theory. A bit more ultramarine. I think I might just go touch darker, you know, just a shade darker in here. just a little bit. Right, and then I'll just try with the palette knife. Might not actually work that well at the moment, but I've got a nice square edge palette knife. I just want to add a few more of these masts in because they're so far in the distance. I don't want to have a sort of a thick, large brush stroke, so just sort of the edge of the palette knife can be great for these sort of hit and miss edges where you find yeah, where you find these sort of masts. And where are we? There we go. Sometimes the paint doesn't come off the palette knife, of course, but some bigger, some smaller. Probably can take that off slightly. Let's go in with some white as well, especially as it against the dark. You know, you often find if you're looking at a mast, if it's against a dark background, you'll see the light, and if it's against the lighter sky, even though this isn't the lightest sky possible, it will still show up sort of darker than the sky. Right, just pop those two back in. And just put some of that up there actually. Make it slightly warmer. Got some red on my finger there, but that's okay. Right. So I did notice as a boat that was very much a Viridian green. You don't, apart from traffic lights, you don't often use. I don't often get to use Viridian in its sort of almost purest form. And it is in shadow, so I should probably knock it back a little. And I'm doing that with a bit of the light red because red and green are complementaries, and they'll just sort of play against each other and mute it down. But just a hint of the colour there. It'd be nice to paint that boat a bit closer, so can make more of that Viridian colour. But the other thing is a bit of yellow in there actually, and all these sort of separate colours. I'm mixing with a little bit of the of sort of the lightest colour left on my palette, which is a sort of a blue-grey, and that just helps them to again be in harmony with the rest of the painting and not stick out too much. It just adds a bit of variety. There's some orange in there as well, so a bit of the bright red with the cadmium yellow into the mix of the yellow that had the sky sort of grey blue in it would be quite nice to add in there. And probably just link it through there. Only needs to be subtle. Right. Just noticed that perhaps I'd lost a little bit of the dark here just a touch, so I think I might put that back in just to provide a nice step into the painting. I'll add a bit of yellow ochre into that because it's slightly purpley, so and then I think probably for this painting at this stage, there might not be a lot more to say. The only, I mean, the thing is, I always find it's good to let a painting sit, and you know, when you look back at it, you think, wow, that's a glaring mistake, which you can't always see when you're painting it and you're that close to it. So I'm sure there will be things to change. Right, in fact, one thing I think I will do, may work or it may not, but if it doesn't work as well, I can always paint it out later. But of course this, I think this probably should be slightly, just have a bit of difference in colour from the beach to show that it's on the water. In doing so, I may have lost a bit of the intensity, but that's something that would be lovely to pop on with a bit of dry brush later on. Don't want to go too white. There we go. Just losing some of those edges. May have lost them a little bit too much. So back in the Naples yellow, titanium white, and a touch of the tile colour, and just put some of this back in. There we go. Yeah, this would be a nice edge to make slightly drier and slightly more broken, but it's a little bit difficult at the moment because the paint underneath is quite wet still. There we go. Right. Only one last thing I can think of at this stage to do, and that's just to take down some of this intensity of the dark here. To just break it up with a slightly sort of lighter purple colour. Right. Other than that, I think for that first sort of go at the painting, I think that's probably as far as I can push it while it's still wet. Once it's dried, I can go back in and put some cleaner highlights, perhaps some cleaner colour, and some more sort of pinpricks of detail, or perceived detail at least, smaller brush strokes and that kind of thing, which will just sort of make the whole thing feel a little more lively. But that's a good kind of a good session of sort of paint to put down at this stage. So thank you very much.